This 2024-2025 NBA Southwest Division betting preview edition of the NBA Gambling Podcast on the Sports Gambling Podcast Network is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Sign up with promo code NBA SGPN to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. We're also brought to you by Rhythm. Start crushing college football and the NFL with Rhythm. Get your 7-day free trial today by going to sportsgamblingpodcast.com/rhythm. That's sportsgamblingpodcast.com/RITHMM. Welcome, everyone, to the NBA Gambling Podcast, part of the Sports Gambling Podcast Network. Here to get into our second division preview for the upcoming NBA season. We'll get to the Southwest division here on this episode. We'll recap what we saw last season in this division. We'll talk about some of the offseason moves for each of these teams, talk about the division odds, win totals, make miss playoffs, all that good stuff, and wrap it up with a best bet for the Southwest division. Touch on some NBA news that we did get over the weekend, and then we'll go from there. But joining me here to help me break everything down on the hardwood for the Southwest division, I got my guy here with me, Scott Studio Reichel. Scott, what's going on, my man?
Yeah, doing pretty well. Definitely had fun doing the Southeast, and now we're going to do the Southwest. Pretty interesting division. Seems like this is a division that features a lot of teams that could be somewhat competitive or pretty competitive in the Western Conference. So once again, a lot of overall talent in the division. Should be fun. Bit of uncertainty involved, which is kind of what you look for if you want some betting opportunities. So it should be a fun division to preview.
Yeah, I think this division, when I was kind of going through it, like you mentioned, I think that you can definitely find some value in this division when it comes to the futures markets. It was a little bit cut and dry when we did the Southeast division that there was going to be some bottom feeders in that division, knowing that the Wizards and the Hornets were probably not going to be as good. But I think there's definitely some intrigue with all these teams in this division. But before we do get into the Southwest division, obviously the big news over the weekend in the NBA that was taken by storm, the trade between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the New York Knicks. Minnesota trading Karl-Anthony Towns over to the Big Apple in return. The Minnesota Timberwolves do get Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, and a future first-round draft pick. I believe that's via the Detroit Pistons. But I felt like last season, the season prior, that there was going to be a cat trade happening sooner rather than later. And we already had seen some type of rumors that whether it was going to be New York or to another team for Karl-Anthony Towns. And for Julius Randle, last season was a short one, dealing with the shoulder injury, opted for shoulder surgery. Didn't play any games, obviously, in the playoffs there for the New York Knicks. But I think the consensus from everything that, from the NBA people that I follow and respect, felt like a little bit of a lateral move. I think the big key addition, obviously, for the Minnesota Timberwolves is having Dante DiVincenzo. I mean, he's been one of the better role players over the past several seasons. Kind of now, unfortunately, turning into a journeyman, because he can definitely be that guy for a team that can bring energy either off of the bench. Possibly could be a 6th man of the year candidate if his numbers or his minutes do stay consistent. But initial reaction here for you, Scott, on this trade between the Knicks and the Timberwolves.
So I know when it initially dropped, I had an immediate response to it, and it seemed like we kind of disagreed slightly on who we thought might have won the trade. I think Minnesota won the trade, personally.
Okay.
Now, I think the Knicks did do a lateral move, so I'm not going to say they got worse. You could argue they got slightly better. Did they get good enough to beat the Celtics? I would say no. So once again, a bit of a lateral move there. If Philly stays healthy, who knows? That could be an interesting series, but I don't trust Cat to guard Embiid. Embiid might be injured again because it's the playoffs, but you get what I'm trying to say. I don't think it really does much to actually help the Knicks' title window by any means. In fact, you could argue that it actually kind of hurts the title window because of Cat's contract, which is why I think the Timberwolves won the trade, because Cat's actually entering year 1 of an extension, and he's getting paid $49.2 million this year, $53+ million next year, $57 million the year after that, and then he has a player option in 27-28 for $61 million. So Minnesota looked at the contract and said, absolutely not, we're not paying you that. So Randle might be on the team for maybe even 1 year. He's a free agent at the end of the year. There is a chance they end up potentially flipping him or letting him walk And in that case, you just got a bunch of cap space that you would have had to pay Cat. Now, Cat is a player that has frustrated me for a long time, and I'm sure I'm not alone on that.
Yeah.
Now, last year's stats were fine. I mean, he averaged 19 and 9, only shot 46.6% from the floor. Pretty interesting playoffs because he was very good against Denver, where he shot 51% from the floor and 39% from three. But he was awful against Dallas. I ended up shooting 37.9% from the floor. He only shot 24.2% from three. So once again, Cat had the up and down playoff, I'd say, performance that we expected, because we kind of get that every year that he makes the playoffs. So I think sometimes in the NBA, especially with the new salary cap, with the CBA, with the aprons, you got to be very shrewd with your money. And paying Cat that much money, I feel like would have hurt this team moving forward. So even though Minnesota, you could argue, cut their title window short, even though they didn't really have much of a window to begin with because they made a pretty deep run, beat Denver. I don't think anybody thought that was going to happen. Then they had a series against Dallas where they kind of blew a couple games to start the series, and they lost in, what was it, 5 in that series, I think?
Yep.
So they weren't really that close, and they were still pretty fortunate to beat Denver in the first place, being down 20. I mean, they were down 3-2, but they were down 20 in the second half on the road, and ended up coming back and winning. So I think that Minnesota's front office looked at the overall roster. Yes, the Gobert contract is still not great, and yes, we're going to get into that in, once again, potentially in a future episode. But the point is, with the amount of money Cat was being paid, and the amount of stress you have of making sure you have solid contracts with the new CBA and the new apron system, I think sometimes you got to take a step back in order to take 2 steps forward. And it just felt like Cat, with that salary cap, was, or I should say salary cap hit, was going to be very difficult to actually build a serious title contender around. Now, I like DiVincenzo a lot. I think getting a first-round pick from Detroit is definitely not the worst thing in the world. That team's terrible. But I think looking at the overall, I'd say, blueprint for both teams, the Knicks are in win-now mode.
Right.
And they made a trade that I don't think really helped them win now. I think that they are kind of in the same boat as where they were before the trade in the first place. They lost Hartenstein, so they had to make a move for a center. But I don't think paying Cat all that money is going to help them win a title over the next couple years. As for Minnesota, I'm not saying they're going to win a title either, but cap flexibility goes a long way when you have Ant, who's going to be entering the prime of his career a couple years from now, and you're hoping, I'm not saying you're going to keep him in Minnesota for his entire career, but you're hoping that you can, and now you kind of open up some possibilities. So overall, I didn't think either team like extremely won the trade. I think that it was Minnesota winning. If I had to grade it, I'd go Minnesota B+. I'd go with the Knicks probably like a B-. Nothing that was that lopsided. But I had to lean to Minnesota. I like the cap flexibility. Yes, the Gobert contract's a problem, and that's all going to throw a wrench into things. But I like getting Cat's contract off the books, which gives you more options to move forward.
Yeah, I think that's what it really was for Minnesota as well, right? Like you mentioned, that Rudy Gobert contract there as well. Like you couldn't afford to pay both Cat and Gobert, right? And try to build a championship contender, knowing that you're also eventually going to also have to pay Anthony Edwards, who I don't even think has reached his potential or his prime yet. Like you mentioned, I think we're probably still another year or two away from him like fully being in his prime. And that's kind of scary for the league as well. But if Minnesota really wants to keep, like you mentioned, Anthony Edwards around for the entirety of his career, that they're going to have to build a championship contender around him and possibly pair him with another star. If in fact Julius Randle does walk, or they flip him at the trade deadline this upcoming season as well. So and again, from an XO standpoint as well, I just feel like the fit right in New York with Julius Randle and Jalen Brunson probably wouldn't have worked, especially with the other guys that they did acquire, right? I mean, OG Anunoby's not a guy that really requires having the basketball in his hands. I think you could make the same argument about Mikal Bridges, but I think they were fully convinced, and rightfully so, that Jalen Brunson is the focal point of the offense for this New York Knicks team. And, you know, when we talked about Minnesota, that they were relying, and I think I mentioned this on Twitter, that they had relied on Karl-Anthony Towns to be that number 2 guy, and he wasn't really consistently able to live up to that expectation of being that number 2 guy next to Anthony Edwards, and they're still kind of in search for that guy. But now going over to the New York Knicks, where maybe he doesn't have to be that number 2 guy, because you still have several other options on guys that can score the basketball for you as well. But the amount of money that they're paying Cat, yeah, that expectation needs to be there for him to be that number 2. But Um, I agree with you. I don't think that it really gets them past Boston, especially at the depth that they have and how they were able to win a championship last year. Um, but also, I mentioned this as when I tweeted this out that this could be more of an expanded role for Naz Reid, right? Because he was really incredible for this Minnesota Timberwolves team as well. So maybe his numbers or his minutes increase. He's a guy that can rebound the basketball. He can knock down that 3-point shot. He could get to the basket for you as well. So maybe something almost similar to what Cat was doing for this Minnesota Timberwolves team that you're paying a whole heck of a lot less money for Naz Reid to kind of be in that similar role of what Cat was doing for this Minnesota Timberwolves team. So like you mentioned, I really do like to pick up for the Wolves with Dante DiVincenzo. It gives them another guy that can play defense. He can knock down a 3-point shot for you as well, and just has, he can guard multiple positions for that team there as well. So, yeah, I think the grades that you gave out, I think were pretty accurate. I think a lot of the talk was about really just dumping the salary for Cat, knowing that number one, you already had Gobert on the books. Eventually, you're gonna have to pay Anthony Edwards as well. And at the same time, probably have to bring in another guy next to Anthony Edwards and pay him to build a championship roster for this Minnesota Timberwolves team. So we'll leave it at that. I know the trade is not officially official yet. I know that NBA Media Day is today here on Monday, September 30th, and the NBA. And Tibbs already came out and said that he couldn't comment on it just yet because it isn't official by the front offices and the league, thus, or at least up until Monday morning here. But anything else you want to mention for the trade before we get into the division here?
Oh, yeah, just one thing. One other problem you might see on the horizon for the Knicks is the amount of games that Cat's actually played. So to go through his numbers since the 2019-2020 season, 35, 50, 74, 29, 62. Have fun playing for Tibbs.
And now you're going to go over to a coach that likes to play his starters anywhere from 37 to 43 minutes per night, where Cat has been dealing with injuries, I guess we can say, over the past couple seasons and not been able to play games. But we'll expand more into when we get to the Atlantic Division, also the Northwest Division there as well for Minnesota and the New York Knicks, respectively. But before we do get into the Southwest Division here, SGPN has the most D-Gen pregame show in the world. Saturday, the College Experience YouTube is live starting at 11 a.m. Eastern time. For the NFL, the Propcast kicks off at 11 a.m. Sunday Eastern time, followed by Sports Gambling Podcast at noon Eastern. So get all your last-second bets, D-Gen parlays, your calls, and make more money along with us. All right. Scott, let's get into the first team here for the Southwest Division. We'll kind of go from the bottom and work our way up. We'll start here with the San Antonio Spurs. They come into this season with a win total of 36.5. Division odds are currently sitting at 28-1 for the Spurs team. And for them to make the playoffs is at plus 380. And for them to miss the playoffs is at minus 525. Last season, of course, the first season for Mr. Victor Wembanyama, who led, or I should say, the Spurs finished with a record of 22-60 last year. A couple of notes going into this season for this San Antonio Spurs team is that they will be without Devin Vassell to start the season. I see he deals with an injury, recovering from that. And looking at some of their offseason moves or what the projected lineup is going to be for this Spurs team. I know they added Chris Paul to kind of be that veteran with this team, a voice in the locker room. I think a pretty good pairing next to Victor Wembanyama. But again, we're not sure how many minutes we're actually going to get from Mr. Chris Paul in this Spurs offense and / rotation here. So let's start with the win total here. Anything from last season you want to mention, Scott, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, I'm going to go under for their win total. I feel like when you're looking at their overall offseason, yes, Chris Paul is going to be a veteran presence, and in the past, we've seen him take some young upstart teams like Oklahoma City, for example, to the playoffs. Now, the problem is Chris Paul's up there in years, and I'm being pretty generous because his body's kind of fallen apart on him for the last couple of years. So I don't know how many games he's going to play. You touched on that before. They also got Harrison Barnes. As you know,
your favorite player.
Yeah, one of my favorite players in the league. Yeah. Okay. So the point is, I don't think they really did anything in the offseason. Now, the argument is Chris Paul is going to help from a veteran leadership perspective, but you are looking at Chris Paul, who played 58 games last year, mostly on the bench with Golden State. He played 26 minutes, give or take, averaged 9.2 points, 6.8 assists. So he's well past his prime. He's 39. He gets injured every year. So we're assuming that Chris Paul is going to probably miss at least 15 games in the season. Is that fair?
Yeah, at minimum.
So you're looking at that. You have Harrison Barnes, who I'm sure it's well documented how much I don't like him as a player. And then what else did they do this offseason? Did they do really anything? Because I'm looking
No.
at their overall depth chart right now. Vassell's going to be out. They announced that the other day. He's going to be out for, I think, a couple of weeks, if not months, right? Isn't he going to be out?
It's going to be a little bit till they get him back.
That's what I'm saying. So Vassell averaged 20 points per game last year. Like, that's a solid player. Now, Keldon Johnson, I think's okay. Sochan, I think's fine. I hated him as a point guard, but I liked him like when he kind of switched positions, or I should say, I think he was more tolerable when he switched positions. Wemby's Wemby. Like, I think Wemby's going to be phenomenal. The question is, do you think Wemby can single-handedly carry this team to sniffing a play-in spot, or maybe even just not finishing in the basement? I think the answer is no. You have a great draft coming up. Why would you be going for this?
Yeah.
We saw the Spurs kind of tank for Wemby about a year or two ago, and now you have another potential superstar in Cooper Flagg coming in. I'm not saying they're going to get him, but if the argument is we've seen the Spurs team tank before, and this is a very, very tough division. They have the lowest win total at 36.5. It's a very tough division. If you're out of it with maybe a month or two to go, why would the Spurs be going for it? Like, I just don't see any incentive for the Spurs to try to push for a play-in spot when you have a couple of really, really good top prospects coming in. So I like the under. I think the total's way too high. The Spurs last year won, I think it was 22 games. Now you had Chris Paul past his prime. You had Barnes, who I don't really like. And you're also assuming perfect health from Wemby, who played a lot of games last year. And now you have to wonder if, of course, with his overall size and overall stature, you think, he's done a good job in Europe as well, staying healthy.
Yeah.
That's a concern. Like, if Wemby gets hurt, you're screwed. This team's going to be the worst team in the league probably if Wemby gets hurt. So you got to factor that in. So I'm on the under. I think with the overall talent in this division and with the, let's just say, lack of moves they made to lift this team's upside, no offense to Chris Paul. I love Chris Paul, but in 2024, he's not a needle mover. He's not going to win you that many extra games, and you're probably going to limit his minutes anyway. I'm on the under. This team, I think, might not even reach 30 wins. I think this total's insane. I'll go with the under.
You don't think Mamu Kilishvili, your guy's not going to move the needle here for the San Antonio Spurs?
Unfortunately, Wemby's in his paths. It's going to cut into his minutes, which is kind of going to hurt him. But I like him. I think he's a fun player for energy purposes off the bench. But in reality, with Vassell being out, that's probably your second best scorer on the entire team. Sure. And now he's out for probably a couple months. That's going to hurt even more. I'll go with the under. I'm not sure this team's going to score.
Yeah, so I know they added Castle in the draft last season, but he's a little further down the depth chart and probably needs some development, of course, in the G League, or I don't know if we still even have the G League, but you know what I mean. But yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, right? They brought in two veterans and maybe, I don't know, be the voices in the locker room. But we're talking from an X's and O standpoint, where I think the division got better overall with the additions that some of the other teams that did make, whether it's health addition there or by free agent moves. I think that the Spurs are going to continue being in that bottom of the Southwest Division here. And like you mentioned, right, the draft coming up after this season, for this upcoming season, it's going to be a really good one. So I think that the main concern, or the main concentration, I should say, for this Spurs team is building around Wemby, whether that's through the draft or, having guys come in free agency that can be needle movers. And now, Chris Paul was going to end up somewhere. I think that, having him in that locker room and on the floor, it'll be great for this team. But until you don't get Devin Vassell back, who's going to be missing an early part of the season here for the Spurs team, you're really rolling the dice and trying to figure out who that second guy is going to be for this Spurs team. I know they had Jeremy Sohan, but they tried him at, was it last year, Scott, that they were trying him at the point guard position, just didn't work out.
But that was for the first couple months last year. Then they finally gave Trey Jones an actual spot.
Yeah. So you have Trey Jones coming in after Chris Paul. I don't know if Chris Paul will be the day one starter or if he's going to be coming off of the bench again. Keldon Johnson, he's been okay throughout his career, early part of his career as well. So there's not much to go on outside of Wemby here. So yeah, I'm with you. I think the under is the play here. I think the number that popped in my head was around 32 wins for this Spurs team.
I think they might tank. I got them in the 20s, honestly. Like, they were 22 last year.
Yeah.
If they end up with around 29, but they start sitting Wemby and people like at the end of the year and they go on maybe like a 10-game losing streak to wrap up the season. That would not shock me. Like, I could see that being a realistic outcome. So I'm in the 20s. I did look up the Spurs draft pick situation just to make sure they had their own pick. They have 4 first-round picks next year. Now, the problem is the Bulls and the Hornets picks are protected 1 through 10 for the Bulls, 1 through 14 for Charlotte, so they can't get those. They have Atlanta's pick with no protections at all. So if Atlanta misses the playoffs, they got a shot at it as well. I think the Spurs are going to be tanking in the back half of the year. I just don't think this team's good enough. We know the Western Conference is stacked from top to bottom. It's not going to be easy to make the playoffs, and this team's not good enough. So I don't know what the incentive is. You basically tanked part of last year anyway. Might as well tank again and try to get maybe an extra ping pong ball for Cooper Flag. So I'm in the high 20s, maybe low 30s, but 36.5 in this division. If it was the Southeast division, maybe, but Southwest division, that's a bit tough. I'll go with the under.
All right, before we get over to the next team in this division for the Southwest, let me tell everyone, our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy has one of the biggest menus for all sports: NFL, college football, MLB, MMA, WNBA, NASCAR, and more. Their lobby is jam-packed with profit boosts, and you can now use specials and boosts on all flex entries. So sign up with promo code NBA SGPN to claim your special pick and first-time deposit offer up to $1,000 in bonus cash. That's UnderdogFantasy.com. Make sure you guys use our promo code NBA SGPN. All right, Scott, let's get over to the next team in this division, and we'll go to my part of the world. That is going to be the Houston Rockets. Last season, this team finished up with a record of 41-41, finished right at 500, a team that was really, really good at home. They were one of the better ATS teams at home last season as well, 27-14 straight up. Did struggle on the road last year with a completely opposite record, 14-27. They're on the road. They were pretty good in the conference as well. They finished up 28-24 against Western Conference opponents. Coming into this season, they have a win total of 43.5, with division odds currently set at 8-1 for this Houston Rockets team. For them to make the playoffs are at plus 120. And then also for them to miss the playoffs around minus 145. Definitely shop around, try to get the best numbers here. But when we talk about this Rockets team, the first word that kind of comes to my mind here is logjam, because there's a lot of guys on this roster where you can play in different positions. I know we signed Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks last season. I think Fred VanVleet may be one of the trade candidates, whether it's at the trade deadline for this upcoming season or at the in the off season for next year. But right now, the starting lineup is projected to be Fred VanVleet, Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, Jabari Smith Jr., Alperen Şengün, and then off the bench, I mean, this team could probably be a starting team on its own with Amen Thompson, Reed Shepherd, Jayshawn Tatum, Cam Whitmore, and Steven Adams for the top 10 guys. And let's not forget, they still have Tari Eason as a number 11 and Jock Lindell. So a lot of opportunity here for this Rockets team. And I think my biggest gripe right now is trying to figure out with Ime Udoka on which direction this team wants to go and who is that number one guy for this team. Is it Jalen Green? Is it Alperen Şengün? And I think this season will be telling about which, guy is going to be that number one option for this Rockets team. But let's start with the win total. I'll get in more into the X's and O's type of things and what I kind of expect from the players. But right now, the win total is in at 43.5 here. Scott, what are your thoughts on this Rockets team?
So we're going to look at the actual Houston roster from different perspectives, because you said a logjam. I see depth. I think this roster is very deep. I think you can make the argument they're lacking an actual star, which is pretty obvious. Şengün, I think, is very good, but I don't know if he can be the number one player on a potential top 5 seed in the Western Conference. But you are looking at the overall lineup. Amen Thompson was very good last year. Some injuries paved the way for him, so we'll see what the actual rotation is going to be. That's a question mark. But when you have Cam Whitmore and potentially Eason and even maybe Jabari Smith Jr., I think he's going to start, because you're probably looking at Amen Thompson. So you're looking at Thompson, Whitmore, Eason, maybe if you want to throw Steven Adams in there, and Reed Shepherd is a rookie who I liked a lot out of the class. Mm-hmm. They're a really deep team. Not many teams can go 9-10 deep and actually feel pretty good about it. Their bench should be a very, very good bench compared to the rest of the league. So I like this roster. Now, once again, they are missing that type of star player. Dylan Brooks thinks he's a star player, but he's not. But that's a separate story. Van Vliet, they paid a lot of money for. He gives you leadership. It gives you some facilitating. I still think it's a lot of money for a guy that does not shoot above 40% most of the time, or shoots like in the low 40s most of the time. So I think that he's still inefficient, and that's the problem you run into. But I think I like the over on this team. They won 41 games last year. People forgot how badly they collapsed in the last couple weeks. Like, they should have made the play-in. They completely imploded and unraveled down the stretch. They were awful on the road. They're very good at home, though. For reference, they were 27 and 14 at home, and they were 14 and 27 on the road. I think this team's pretty good. Like, I'm not saying they're going to be able to get to like 50 wins or anything, but I think Udoka's a pretty good coach, or at least the way that he conducted the overall rotations and how he handled this overall roster last year, I thought was pretty solid. This team was in a playoff spot for most of last year, and they kind of unraveled. Some injuries came in the way, but the point is, I do think this team, with the depth they have, can sneak up on some teams, and I like their depth. Now, I do wish they had another complimentary star next to Şengün. Spoiler, I don't think Jalen Green's a star. He had a moment there for like 2 weeks last year where he looked like he was blossoming him in, and then he reverted to what he was previously. So Jalen Green's still a bit too inconsistent for me, which is not exactly ideal, but I like their roster. I think their coach is pretty good. I'm not saying that Udoka's a top 5 coach in the league, but I think that he's probably top half if I had to break it down. So I think there's a lot to like about this team. I like the over because, once again, they had 41 wins last year. They were awful on the road, and they also fell apart down the stretch. So there are a couple of reasons to actually like this team with another year of maturity added on to the youth of this roster. I like the over. I'm not saying it's going to be a lot, but I think they can get to 45.
Yeah, I think that what you mentioned about Jalen Green, like I think going into the second year for him, I knew that he wasn't going to be that star for this team. And it's just been really about his inconsistencies, that it's usually been in the second half of the year where we're seeing the potential of Jalen Green, where we need to see it more from the jump of the season for this team to have that success. So I don't think that he's that number one type of player. Maybe Şengün's not either. And I think the next step for this Rockets team is going to be going out and finding that next all-star superstar player to add to this roster. But I mean, like you mentioned, I say logjam, but I think you're right that the right word is probably depth for this team, because you have guys coming off this bench that can that are absolute studs. They're dogs. I know they call them the Goon Squad here when you have Tari Eason, Jayshawn Tate, and then Cam Whitmore, that was coming off of the bench for this team last year. I feel like the odd man out, or when it does come to trade rumors, I think Jayshawn Tate could be a guy that could be a piece for a contending team. So I feel like that he may be a guy that could be on the move, or it possibly could even be Tari Eason. But I know Tari Eason's more of a fan favorite here down here in Houston.
A lot. The issue was he got injured, but his activity on the boards was really, really important for this team.
Yeah, and he's a guy that can knock down those corner 3-point shots for you as well. So I feel like it might be Jayshawn Tate that may be on the move here for this Rockets team, whether it's at the trade deadline or prior to that. But again, it is, Dylan Brooks, again, not going to be a part of the future for this team. You know, there's moments where he did turn into Steph Curry, Scott. Let's not forget that in the fourth quarter, some of those games last year for this Rockets team. But he really brought that defensive identity and that expectation where
I was going to say intensity, but okay.
Intensity there as well. I think that's the right word, because prior to the Steven Silas regime, this defense was absolutely atrocious. And I think that was a big improvement for this team last year, and accountability, I think, as well, when you brought in Ime Udoka, because guys that were under Steven Silas were getting away whatever they wanted pretty much in the locker room there as well. There was just no accountability and structure. And I think that's what Ime Udoka really brought to this team and roster. So I mean, I could sit here and talk about hours for about the Rockets, but I do like the over here at 43.5. I think it's a team that could get 45 to 46 wins here, and they do get into either that 5th or 6th spot or be in that play-in tournament bracket there. So again, they still have a lot of draft capital as well, do this Rockets team. And let's not forget, when some of those trades were happening around the draft time, I mean, they were rumored to wanting to go out there and get Kevin Durant on this roster. So they are going to swing for the fence at some point. I'm really intrigued by Reed Shepard as well. He's going to be an absolute sniper for this team. I mean, you mentioned it, that I thought he was also one of the best players, if not the best player in this past draft, and we were able to get him, I think, with number 3 overall pick for this Rockets team. So that gives you another great 3-point shooter for this Rockets team. So yeah, I'll go with the over here as well for this Houston Rockets team, over 43.5. Anything else for this Rockets team here, Scott?
Yeah, I'll take them to make the play-in at about plus 125. Even if they don't make the playoffs, they should finish top 10.
Yeah.
Like, I think they could sneak into the last spot. Once again, they should have made it last year. They fell apart. So I don't mind the Rockets. They're the favorites in the market to make the play-in, but it's plus 125. I like that price. I think they'll finish around there. They're definitely not going to bottom out. So I'll go with the Rockets to make the play-in at plus 125.
All right, let's get over to the next team in this division. That is going to be the New Orleans Pelicans, who come into this season with a win total of 46.5. Their division odds currently sitting at plus 380. For them to make the playoffs is minus 170, and for them to miss the playoffs is at plus 140. This was a team last year that finished one game behind the division. For them to win the Southwest Division, finished with a record of 49-33. And coming into the season for this Pelicans team, obviously the big move was the acquisition of DeJounte Murray at that point guard position for this Pelicans team. And it was an area that they were, I think, lacking a little bit. Maybe that CJ McCollum wasn't the answer for this team at that point guard position, because, again, feel like he is well past his prime right now, and not having to really rely on him to be that number 2 or number 3 guy on this roster when you still have Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson on this roster as well. Like the depth of this team as well. They just signed Jose Alvarado to a contract extension, 2 years, $9 million. They also have Jordan Hawkins from the draft from a couple seasons ago. Trey Murphy III, Herb Jones. A little bit lacking, I think, at that center position, because it is going to be Daniel Tice. Yeah, a little, say it at least.
They probably have the worst center group in the entire league. A little.
Yeah, okay, we can say that the worst, one of the worst, we'll say, at that center position. They had Valanciunas there last year before he signed over with the Washington Wizards that we talked about in that Southeast Division. So there could be some opportunities during the regular season with rebounding props for maybe a guy like Zion, or even Brandon Ingram for this team, maybe even the Herb Jones of the world. But it feels like this roster is starting to come together a little bit for this Pelicans team outside of the center position here. We can expand on that. Maybe there'll be the market, of course, at the trade deadline for a name there, Scott. But Pelicans right now with a win total of 46.5. What are your thoughts on this team?
So can they just call up the Rockets and just get Steven Adams?
That would be
it just feels like a simple move that's probably not going to take much. But
yeah,
I don't know what the role for Adams is going to be on the Rockets, but it makes a lot of sense for this team. I think that could be an option if you want to go low budget. But for the Pelicans, I'll go with the over. They got the 49 last year. Ingram is still here somehow after Dort destroyed his soul in that playoff series last year. Zion, though, had some quotes where it seems like he's fully engaged. I got a rant on that in a second, but I like DeJounte. I think DeJounte is a good player. I think that he was in a bad spot with Trae Young. Defensively is not great, but I do think when you're looking at him with Herb Jones, and the defense could be a concern. Like, I'll point that out, but I do think that DeJounte, who is a big shot taker and maker, I think can help them. A lot of shot makers on this team. I'm a big fan of Trey Murphy. I kind of wish he was on another team because I want to see him get a bunch of minutes, but he's really good as a three-point shooter. I think this team got better during the offseason. I've never been a big Larry Nance Jr. guy. Now, the problem is they didn't replace him with anybody worth a damn. They have no center. But I'm not a big Larry Nance Jr. guy, and that's been well documented before. Valanciunas was fine. You can't really play him more than 25 minutes in today's NBA, but at least he gave you some size, which they don't have. So the real issue is going to be rebounding, and you might want to just bet every opposing center to go over the rebounds against this team. But assuming Zion does take some type of leap, hoping he actually plays more than 50 games in a season, Ingram's still there. You still have McCollum, who we know is still a solid scorer. And I'm not the biggest McCollum guy, but he averaged 20 points per game last year, basically, so that's still a solid amount of scoring. I like their offensive firepower. I think that they have depth. I think that Murray, McCollum, Ingram, and Zion's a pretty dangerous foursome, and you throw in Trey Murphy. That's a lot of guys you have to guard. I think that they can score a lot of points. Now, they might be an over team because I'm not sure they're going to stop anybody in the paint. But I do think the Pelicans, who got to 49 last year, and I think got better, I'll go with the over. I like their team. I think they can make some noise. The center position's a serious red flag, though. Like, they
Yeah.
have to address that, but I'll go over for now. I think they have a lot of talent, and if Zion ends up staying somewhat healthy, this team can get to 50.
Yeah, and I think that health is always the biggest concern for this Pelicans team, right? Just because of what's transpired in the past for Zion. But Zion, I think last season was very good for this Pelicans team. I know Brandon Ingram was in and out of the lineup last season as well. So ended up playing 64 games last season. CJ McCollum missed about 16 games last year. But Trey Murphy was a guy that was, missed significant time. He played in 57 games, started 23 of those 57. Herb Jones was relatively healthy, started 76 games for this Pelicans team. And then the one guy that's no longer on this roster that played in all 82 games was Jonas Valanciunas. But when we talk about that center position, I think that's a easier acquisition that can be made to kind of, fill that lack thereof, the depth there for this Pelicans team. And I think Steven Adams is a great example that you bring up there. I think that he's not going to get a lot of minutes here with this Rockets team. Another guy that you have in that locker room that, can be a veteran guy, but again, could be very, very serviceable for this Pelicans team in that spot.
They have to trade for a center at some point in the season.
Yeah,
they have.
Yeah. I also do like the over for this Pelicans team. I know you and I were a fan of this team a couple seasons ago, and they ended up making the playoffs. I don't know if we had taken them to make the playoffs, had some nice plus odds, or it was the division for them to win. But another team that really has that roster coming together, right? And I think that, if Zion again is able to play another 70 games, he's able to stay healthy. I think that's always going to be big for this Pelicans team. Brandon Ingram, at least during the regular season, we know he's going to miss a handful of games, anywhere from that 10 to 15 mark. But again, if those two guys are able to stay healthy, and I think when we talk about health, especially for this division, I think those are two guys that can really get in and give this team a boost for this Pelicans team. So I'm with you on the over here for the Pelicans for this upcoming season. All right, Scott, before we get into the final two teams in this division, the Memphis Grizzlies and the Dallas Mavericks, I almost said the Cowboys there. Let me tell everyone about our friends over at Rhythm. Rhythm is, I should say, the proud partner of SGPN. Rhythm is the #1 AI-powered back sports betting platform that helps provide bettors of all levels the ability to build custom predictive betting models in seconds and get predictions for betting on money line spreads, totals, and props. Build your own model, copy one of the top performing models from the leaderboard, or press build a model from me, and Rhythm gives you predictions for every game and player prop, and also has a myriad of stats, research, and trend analysis that give you even more betting insights. Claim your 7-day free trial today by going to sportsgamblingpodcast.com/rhythm. That's sportsgamblingpodcast.com/RITHMM. And we're also brought to you by BetUS. Bet with the best in the business with BetUS. BetUS has been around for more than 30 years. Easily deposit using cryptocurrency and get lightning fast payouts. US players are always welcome. Use our sign-up link and get a 125% bonus on your first 3 deposits. Go to sportsgamblingpodcast.com/BetUS. That's sportsgamblingpodcast.com/BetUS using promo code SGPN so they know that we sent you. BetUS, America's favorite sports book. All right, Scott, let's get into the next team here. I think this one might be just a quicker conversation for me, honestly, with the Memphis Grizzlies. They finished this upcoming season with a win total of 47.5. For them to make the playoffs at -225, for them to miss the playoffs is at +180, with division odds of +260. Last season, this team finished up 27-55. And if you follow the NBA last year, this team had at least 7 to 10 players that were on the injury report for this team. Everybody should be ready to go for this team, led by, obviously, Ja Morant coming back for this team. You also had Marcus Smart that missed the majority of the season last year for this team as well. But again, this has been a team that prior to when they are healthy, Scott, that they can make some noise in this Western Conference. And this team could be one of those teams that, if again, barring health, we always say that potentially could end up being the #1 seed in the Western Conference here. But let's start here with their win total of 47.5. And I'll just quickly mention this, that their projected starting lineup is going to be Morant, Desmond Bane, / Marcus Smart, possibly Luke Kennard, Jaren Jackson Jr., and who knows, maybe Zach Edey's at starting center for this Memphis team. But what do you think about their win total here, 47.5?
Yeah, I'll go with the over. The main concerns, of course, Ja's health. He's played less than 68 games in every game of his career, so that's not exactly ideal. Played 9 games last year. Point is, though, this team was injured to hell and back, and they were still competitive. They didn't win many games, but I thought that Jenkins did a great job last year. They were fielding basically a G League squad, and they were keeping it close in a lot of these games. And I think with that being the case, I think they're well coached. I do think that with the health, I'd say, being better than last year, which is such a low bar, this team has the talent to win 50-plus games. I mean, you mentioned potential 1 seed. I think they're a dark horse candidate. They're pretty popular to be a dark horse candidate to be the 1 seed. I'm not going to go that far, but I think I have to like the over here. This team, when Ja was healthy 2 years ago, 150-plus. I can see that happening again. I'll go over. Everybody got hurt. I kind of have to toss last year out. But I like how Jenkins kind of let the young guys cook a bit. Now, Gigi Jackson's injured. He'll be out for a couple months. But they had a couple guys like Aldama, Laravia had some moments there. They had a couple of young guys who got some run, and I thought they actually looked pretty good. I think they could be solid bench pieces. Give me the over on Memphis. I think that they have a solid roster. I think assuming they stay somewhat healthy, not even fully healthy, somewhat healthy, they'll threaten this. If they stay fully healthy, they're going over. So I'll go with the over. I think that they're better than 47.5 if most of the players don't get injured.
Yeah, and I think that was like really what the theme was for this team last year, right? Because there were guys that were starting for this team at the latter part of the year that probably wouldn't be even on an NBA roster, or maybe would be the number 11 or 12 guy for this team. But when you have guys, yeah, guys like that, right? And again, when you have, like you mentioned with John Morant coming back, he's like you mentioned, he's been dealing with injury. Desmond Bane at some point of the year is going to have that ankle injury where he misses, a week or two for this team. We'll see the stat padding at home for the block shots for Jaren Jackson Jr. For this upcoming season. But also, I'm very intrigued by Zach Edey. I think that he's going to be a great rim protector there for this team. Also at that defensive front, I guess you should say, for this Memphis Grizzlies team. And I mean, that front court that could be one of the best defensive front courts with Jaren Jackson Jr. and Zach Edey there. So the only one concern I do about this team is possibly 3-point shooting. I know you have Desmond Bane, obviously, but how many minutes is actually Luke Kennard going to get out there for this team? But again, he is another 3-point shooter for this team. But I think everything starts and stops there with John Morant for this team. So again, this conversation was probably not going to be as long because of what transpired last season for this team, Scott. But yeah, I think that this team is a 50-win team for this upcoming season here. And, I think we've taken the over on all 3 of the last 4 teams, but I think rightfully so. But do you have anything else for this Memphis Grizzlies team?
Not really. Once again, I just think that Ja, assuming he plays 50-plus games, I like their chances of getting to 50. Jenkins won me over last year. I thought he was fine. Yeah. And then last year, he made a lot out of nothing. So I respect him for keeping the team kind of together in terms of not rolling over and dying. The fact they got the 22 wins last year and Ja played 9 games is kind of a miracle. So I thought Jenkins did a great job last year.
All right, let's get over to the final team in this division. That is going to be the Dallas Mavericks, who were the representative of the Western Conference in the NBA Finals last season. This team finished with a record of 50-32 and made their run to the NBA Finals in the playoffs. They come into this season with a win total of 49.5, division odds of plus 115. For them to make the playoffs, minus 525. For them to miss the playoffs, around plus 380. And I think you got to give a lot of credit, number one, to this this Dallas Mavericks front office for the acquisition that they did make at that trade deadline last year with PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford. I think those 2 moves was really the difference, honestly, for this Mavericks team, propelling them not only during the regular season to win the division, but also making a run in the playoffs last year. Obviously, the big name that they did add to this team is another one of Scott's favorite players, in Klay Thompson.
I thought you were going to say Spencer Dinwiddie. My bad.
Yeah, I was getting there as well.
I was going to say that's another one of my favorite players. So they added a couple,
Yeah, I mean, you're just going to be glued to the Southwest Division for this upcoming season because all your guys are in this division. But obviously, Luka, Kyrie, Klay Thompson slated to be at that small forward position with PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford / Derek Lively. We'll see which one of those 2 guys does end up being the starter for this team. we had a lot of conversation about Klay Thompson. I don't want to, regurgitate everything, but I think now with Klay Thompson coming over to a team where he doesn't have to be that number 2 guy, where he just has to come out and just be a consistent 3-point shooter. And if he gives them that consistent 3-point shooting, this team could be primed to possibly, who knows, make another run to the NBA Finals. Both, I think Luka and Kyrie did a fantastic job last season of coexisting together, because there was a lot of question marks that when the Dallas Mavericks did acquire Kyrie Irving, that were Luka and Kyrie going to be able to coexist, because both those guys but really need the ball to be effective, and more so with Kyrie Irving, because we still know that Luka can rebound the basketball for you and also, dish out the assist there as well. But this, roster seems like it's constructed again to possibly make another run to the NBA Finals. It pains me to say that, with them being the other team in Texas here, Scott. But what are your thoughts on this Mavericks team at the win total of 49.5?
I feel like everybody likes the over on this team because of what they did last year. I'm going to go contrarian. I'm going with the under on this one. Usually we see some teams who make the finals or make a deep run, and there's a bit of burnout where they just played so many extra games in the playoffs that they kind of struggle out of the gates, or they just struggle physically over the course of the season. I like the under. I think this line's a bit high. Now, Luka played 70 games last year, which is actually kind of on the high end for Luka. So if he gets injured, they got problems. Kyrie played 58. That sounds about right. But you're looking at how this team played, and this team was kind of a tale of two halves, because once they traded for Gafford, everything came together, and they were world beaters. So I know that most people will take the over because of what happened last year. I think I'm going to go contrarian under. The fact is they played a lot of playoff games last year. Luka has a pretty long injury history. So does Kyrie. That might come back to bite them. We tend to see some teams, one team every year, make a deep run. They're expected to duplicate it, and they fall apart. I'm not saying Dallas is going to fall apart entirely, but they proved last year they don't care about seeding, because they were able to beat a couple of teams without having home court. So I don't think seeding actually matters for them. And they're going to try to keep Luka and Kyrie healthy. Regular season wins, not really a priority for this team. I see them being out of the play-in, but not being a top 3 seed. Give me that middle ground. I see them around 46, 47 maybe. 50, though, I don't think winning's a priority in the regular season. So I'll go with the under. Big contrarian, I don't think Klay's going to work out that well. I think he's kind of washed. The defensive grouping of Luka, Kyrie, and Klay in 2024, have fun. Have fun with that one. I think that the backcourts are going to torch this defense. So I'll go with the over for the points for other teams, but I'll go with the under on wins at 49.5. I think they'll make the playoffs, but I think that 46 is a realistic number. I'll go with the under on the wins.
Yeah, this was the team that I did struggle with the most as far as this division went, because again, like you mentioned, it could be a team that ends up with anywhere from that 46 to 49 range where they do get under this win total, but a team that could possibly win 50 plus games this upcoming season. But I think the goal number one for this Dallas Mavericks team is going to be keeping Luka as healthy as possible. And, we talk about some of those teams that need their number one guy to have success in the playoffs. I think Dallas is, at the top of that list. Because if you don't have Luka, yes, you still have Kyrie, but I think that what just Luka brings to this table for this Dallas Mavericks team, I don't think, we can really quantify it, but you just really want him to be healthy for the playoffs. And it's something similar to a team that we talked about in the East, where like Miami Heat of the prior years, that it didn't matter where they really ended up in the seedings, but they thought they could just flip a switch and make a run. And maybe Dallas Mavericks is that team in the Western Conference just because of the roster that they do have.
It's not as extreme, but there is definitely the idea of keeping your guys healthy above everything else.
Yeah, and then it's like, okay, let's just say they get in as a 5th or 6th seed into the playoffs, and saying, hey, come now beat this Dallas Mavericks team led by a healthy Luka, led by a healthy Kyrie in a 7-game series. And I think that's a very, very difficult task for some of these teams in the Western Conference here. So I thought this number was spot on here, 49.5, especially how deep or how much better this division got, at least the 4 of the 5 teams that we had just discussed on this episode. So I'll lean under. I'm kind of in your camp there as well. But again, this is not my favorite win total of this division here at 49.5. If this team stays healthy, and again, I know that's a big question mark when we do get to the playoffs, because we've seen it over the past several seasons that star players, especially last year, Scott, that was a concern for especially teams in the Western or Eastern Conference, I should say. do you think this is a team that can make a run to the NBA Finals again, or do you think there's like a one-off deal with this team?
I think they can. I'm not saying they're going to, but I do think when you're looking around the rest of the West, I don't want to spoil our predictions for some of the other teams, but I'm not sure the teams at the top of the West got better. So
Okay.
I think that it's definitely open, and we saw Dallas take advantage of an opportunity. But Minnesota made a trade; they kind of reinvented themselves. Denver has a kind of a weird scenario going on too. I think it's open. I think Dallas has as good of a chance as anybody.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, again, when we talk about having the type of players that they do have, especially in that backcourt, I think defense, like you mentioned, is going to be that huge focus for this team. But this team was very consistent last year, 25 and 16, both on the both at home and on the road for the Dallas Mavericks here. So another team again that's going to be very, very interesting to watch during the regular season for this upcoming year. All right, so that is the fifth and final team for the Southwest Division, making our way from the least win totals up to the biggest win total, we should say, for this division. Scott, let's wrap it up here with a division winner and then a best bet, whether it's a win total, make miss playoffs, anything that you do like as far as an investable item for the season long here for the Southwest Division. What do you got?
Yeah, so for my division winner, I might actually bet on two teams. It's not going to be Dallas. I like the prices on the Grizzlies at 260
Mhm.
and the Pelicans at 380. I think both those are great prices. Now, if you're asking me to pick one, I would pick New Orleans if I had to pick one of those two because I think 380 is a good price. So
Yeah.
much comes down to Ja's health. And you could argue the same things with New Orleans because, of course, Zion's health matters a lot, but they have so many scores on that team with McCollum, with Ingram, with DeJounte now. I think that I just like that price more. For value, give me New Orleans. They lost the division by one game last year, and they got even more firepower offensively. Assuming they trade for a center midseason, I like the price there at plus 380. For my best bet, Spurs under. That total's too high. I did the same thing in the Southeast. Spoiler, I took the worst team in the division, took the under. There are so many teams in this division that I think can push for a playoff spot. The Rockets, the Pelicans, the Grizzlies, the Mavericks all have win totals in the 40s. The Spurs got Chris Paul past his prime and Harrison Barnes, and they drafted Castle, who got injured in summer league, but he was once again putting up some decent numbers, but he shot 37% from the floor.
Mhm.
So I think that they're going to be struggling to win a bunch of games when Wemby has to carry you the entire way. I don't think Chris Paul's corpse is going to help that much on the court. I think it's going to help in the locker room and maybe for a couple games here or there, but he gets injured a lot. The Spurs are the worst team in this division by far. They have 4 first-round picks. They have their own pick. It's a very solid draft class coming in. I don't see them going for it if they're out on the actual playoff race with a month or two left. So give me the Spurs under 36.5. That total feels too high. I'll let the Rockets, the Pelicans, and the Grizzlies and Mavericks fight for playoff spots, with the Spurs being the team that has to face these teams basically 3-4 times a year, and that's not going to go well. So give me the Spurs win total under 36.5 is my lock.
Yeah, I couldn't talk you off it. I mean, we talked about the other 4 teams that we feel like that did improve, barring health, of course, and that's always the conversation for any of these win totals before the season. But I mean, for the Spurs team, that the eventual thing is going to be building around Victor Wembanyama and keeping him healthy as well for the foreseeable future. So not a lot of improvements there for the Spurs team, like we talked about the offseason there. So I think this will be another team that's sub 30s possibly as far as the wins go for this upcoming season. For the division odds, I'm gonna go with Memphis at plus two.
So that was your bet too, or you're just going in order again?
No, I'm just gonna go order
Okay,
here.
cool.
I mean, I agree with you about that pick for the under there. But as far as a division winner here for me, I'm gonna go with Memphis, and I think that they're gonna come in with this season with a kind of a chip on their shoulder. John Morant, in so many words, possibly came out and said that he's gonna remind everybody in this league, who he is, and I think that I can take that for what it's worth from John Morant and getting, having Desmond Bane, who was really good while he did play last season without John Morant, kind of being that scorer for this team. But it's really, I also do like the depth and the young guys that they do have for this Memphis Grizzlies team. So I say all that to take them on the division at plus 260. And I think I'll just double down. I don't want to be a homer and take the Rockets over because I do like their over win total, but I think it's a Memphis team that could get to 50 wins. I think that's what's going to require for a team in this division to win the division is getting to that 50 mark here. So I have about 2 to 3 games to play with there at the 47.5 number. And I know that the injuries are a huge concern, but I think the injury luck Was not with this team last year, obviously going through that injury report, but I think that they can, behind John Moran, Desmond Bain, like I mentioned, be a team that can get to 50 wins here and possibly contend with for that number one spot in the Western Conference there. So really high. And again, you mentioned to add volumes about their head coach, Taylor Jenkins, who I think does a fantastic job coaching this team. So I will go best bet win total over 47.5 for the Memphis Grizzlies and for them to win the division at plus 260. All right, that is going to wrap it up here for this edition of the NBA Gambling Podcast, our second division preview in the books. If you haven't already got a chance to listen to the Southeast Division, plenty of time to do that before the season does start. We're about 22 days away from tip-off for the NBA season, but a lot more coverage and content coming on the NBA Gambling Podcast here. Scott, anything else you want to mention before we get out of here?
Not really. It was fun. Should be a fun division, and hopefully, you tune in for the other division previews.
Yeah, 4 more to go here. We'll get into all those divisions, of course, some future markets as far as players, awards, and all that good stuff. So stay with us. Obviously, with the NBA season around the corner and so WNBA playoffs going on as well. Make sure you guys follow Scott over on the Twitter machine at Reichel Radio. You can follow me there as well at SportsNerd824. Till then, good luck with your bets. Let's break these books off and always remember to let it ride.